Well, Gemara Chatzima Tova. The time is 10:45. We're so happy that you're here with us for learning today. Over the last it's hard to believe. Today is Yom Kippur. Today is Yom Kippur. Over Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we've been engaging in these acts of teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah. We went out of order, actually. I'm not sure if anyone noticed. Is that we've been using this time, this half hour in between Shachrit and Musaf, to engage in this conversation of these three actions that we're supposed to do.
Does this work?
We've already covered the concepts of teshuvah and tzedakah, both of repentance and also of charity. But we didn't cover tefillah, and I wonder, Rabbi Wahlberg, why we went out of order. I think part of it is because tefillah is actually probably the hardest one to kind of conceptualize of all these actions.
I would agree, and I would also say that when we think of the work of trying to repair ourselves and the world, most naturally, I think we would think about trying to make a change in ourselves, which is what teshuvah represents, and then acts of tzedakah really do impact others, the society, the greater world. So we can more easily see why those things that we would be doing might in fact help God lessen the severity of the decree, which is exactly what we are saying through the Unatana Tokef prayer, that if we engage in these three things, it's not that there won't be a decree against us, but we'll lessen the severity of it. But tefillah represents something very different. And for many of us, it might seem like the easiest thing to do because it's just a matter of coming to the synagogue, or in this case, being at home with a prayer book. And as you are asked to participate in a responsive reading, you do that. Or maybe you chant the Shema because you know it. And then there are other prayers that you might read through as well. But what does that do to lessen the severity of the decree? Why do we think that that is somehow effective? Simply reciting words and changing God's opinion about us or what God thinks are the consequences of our actions should be. So I'm glad that we saved this for last, because I think that it requires even more thought.
Perfect. So I think we've asked this question of why does prayer, how does it compare to these other two? And so that's engaged in just in the text itself. So again, if you have the source sheet at home, feel free to follow along. The source sheet is available on our website, perhaps on the link that brought you here. But the first text we're going to be looking at is actually out of order. We're going to look at text number 2, which comes from the Babylonian Talmud. I will make reference actually in just a moment to our Machzorim. So if you don't have the text open, or if you have your Machzor still next to you, I'll invite you to turn to page 261. Again, page 261 in your Machzorim, and you'll see actually here the text we're about to talk about in from the Talmud, coming from Rosh Hashanah 17b. So that's text number 2 on our sheets. But if you don't have that sheet, or you also have your Machzor next to you, I'll invite you to look at page 261, because we'll look at that in just a moment. So what does the Talmud say here? It says that this verse states, "And the Lord passed before him and proclaimed." It's coming from Exodus 34:6. And Rabbi Yochanan said, were it not explicitly written in the verse, it would be impossible to say this, as it would be insulting to God's honor. Well, I'll just give you a little bit of context. What are we talking about? We're talking about, if you look up page 261, you'll see after the red triangle, right before the bold section of Adonai, Adonai, it says, Vayavor Adonai al panav vayikra. It says that God passed before him and called. This is Exodus 34:6 that we're talking about here in the Talmud. And then what's the next part here? Actually, this might look very familiar, especially on Yom Kippur. The next part is Adonai, Adonai el rachum v'chanun erech alpayim v'rav chesed ve'emet. Yotzer chesed la'alafim noseh avon v'yafesha v'chata v'nakeh. We call this the 13 attributes. Adonai, Adonai, God, merciful and compassionate, patient, abounding in love and faithfulness, assuring love for thousands of generations, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, and granting pardon. Why is the Talmud talking about this? This is the moment after the golden calf. This is God talking to Moses about what is forgiveness, right? The Israelites, Moses goes up on the mountain, is supposed to get to the 10 Commandments, comes down, sees that the Israelites, they lost faith. they build a golden calf, they start worshiping it, and when Moses comes down the mountain, he smashes the tablets. This is the moment we're talking about of forgiveness. And so now let's go back into the Talmud. Now we know our context of what's happening here. And what does this verse teach? This is where we're going. The verse teaches that the Holy One, blessed be he, wrapped himself in a prayer shawl like a prayer leader and showed Moses the structure of the order of the prayer. He said to him, whenever the Jewish people sin, let them act before me in accordance with this order. Which Rabbi Steinsaltz adds a little explanation here that says, let the prayer leader wrap himself in a prayer shawl and publicly recite the 13 attributes of mercy, and I will forgive them. Interesting here. Why are we talking about this moment of prayer, the 13 attributes? This is God's moment of showing us that this is supposed to be this important moment that should be compared to tzedakah and shuvah. But I think what Rabbi Wahlberg and I were mentioning before is, how does just saying words make a difference? Doesn't it make more sense, especially if actions speak louder than words? Don't we always say that actions speak louder than words? Then why should our words matter here? I know that seems contradicting to what I said last night, where I said that our words matter. So obviously, I think that words do matter. But here, compared to tzedakah and shuvah, those make sense. Those are actions. But here, what are we learning from this story about the golden calf and God and the 13 attributes? How does that help us compare to teshuvah and tzedakah? Rabbi Wahlberg, what are some initial thoughts for you?
Well, I thank you, Rabbi Hollander, for mentioning the context of this particular set of verses that we're looking at, coming as they do just after the episode of the golden calf. And we recall that God was ready to destroy the entirety of the Jewish people at that point and start over again with Moses. And it was only because Moses pleaded on behalf of the people that they were saved. But what happens right after that in the Torah is that Moses himself starts to worry about whether God is going to be with him and whether he can properly lead this people, whom he has seen are not always faithful to God and to the things that Moses is trying to transmit to them. And Moses asks to see God's presence, to see God's presence. This is at the very end of chapter 33 in the book of Exodus, just before what we're looking at in chapter 34. And God says, no human being can see my presence and live. So I'm going to set you in the cleft of this rock. I'm going to pass by you, and you'll see sort of the aftermath of my having been there, sort of what I'm responsible for. And so that's as much as Moses can see of God. And then comes this Talmudic section, and Rabbi Yochanan suggests that Moses was actually able to see God cloaking God's self in a talit and offering these words, which will forever and ever be enough. What does that mean, enough? If the Jewish people will simply say these words, referring to God's compassion and abounding kindness and his willingness to forgive sin, then how does this section end? It says, Mochel lahem, Bani mochel lahem. God says, I will forgive them. To suggest that all you have to do is say the proper formula and God is ready to forgive. Now, that is mind-boggling. Should it really be that simple that we can transgress, that we can commit a sin, that we can do wrong, and then simply say these words, and like a magic formula, God is ready to forget whatever we've done and say forgiveness is yours? What is special about these words? What makes them so impactful? And does this extend to all types of prayer, or is it only these words?
So I have a lot to ask about that because you brought up a lot of things of God acting, that God wraps himself up in a prayer shawl. I know we even say that Moses sees God's tefillin at some points. I think there's a lot that we can unpack there of trying to understand God in human terms. But I see that there's a hand raised by Stan Weinstein. Stan, if you want to unmute yourself, we'd love to hear some of your thoughts.
Can't.
Okay,
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Okay, fine. It isn't the words, although the words are important. It's the thought behind the words and whether you participate in that thought, have that thought. There's a metaphor from, if you don't mind my mentioning the Harry Potter books, where they first learn about swish and flick and certain words that do certain things, and then at the end they realize it isn't the words, it's the thought. It's cast your spells without the words. Same idea here. Similar idea. Maybe not the same idea, but somewhere. That's what I had.
Thank you so much, Stan. So I'm not sure if you know, Stan, I'll go on a little tangent here. Just last fall, Rabbi Wahlberg and I attended a conference at Penn Hillel, where there was a speaker. His name is Casper, and I don't remember his last name. Fantastic. He, for many different reasons, he's brilliant and really thought thinking about rituals and how we as institutions, religious institutions today can reimagine ourselves. But he's also famous because he made a podcast where he goes through the Harry Potter books as if they are books of scripture and pulls it apart there. So we can definitely use Harry Potter as a great example there of the importance of kavanah behind our words. And so you bring that up of maybe there's more than just the words here. So when we look at the Talmud itself, right, there's more than just that. We have here, I know that this is all in this translation uses God in a masculine sense, but it says that God wrapped himself with a talit. It makes it remind us of a little bit of the kavanah that we also have, right? Before we started Kol Nidre yesterday, we wrapped ourselves in our talit for those that wear, and we do that today too. It's interesting, we are acting like God. It's a little bit of what Rabbi Elazar had done here, Rabbi Yochanan here, that we have here in this text, because Rabbi Yochanan notices the words that come right before the 13 attributes, which is Vayavor Adonai al Panav Vayikra, that God went before, went Vayavor. Usually when the rabbis talk about Vayavor, it's because it's about a prayer leader going before, passing before the ark. That's how they referred to someone who was being the Sholech Zibor, being the prayer leader. So it's interesting here that he picks up on that, and he's making it clear that God is acting as the prayer leader here. It's not just the words, right, that we learned that God offered in this moment that is supposed to show Moshe, but it's also the intention behind that. Maybe it's wrapping ourselves up in our talit, having that moment of kavanah behind it. But there's more of why specifically these words. I think there's something here that maybe God's trying to teach us is that, well, our words matter. And maybe God is reminding us that if you keep reminding me of these words, well, when I hear, well, how often it sometimes we might not think our words matter until someone can quote it and say, well, you said that yourself, and say, wow, you know, like when you hear your own words and realize that how can you argue with yourself? And so we're using God's words against God, I guess, or with God. I think that that's an important idea here as well. That on Yom Kippur, as we're asking for atonement, we are using God's words, that reminder, just as when we blow the shofar here, we're hoping that God is blowing the shofar up in heavens as well.
Yes, and these words are not relegated only to Yom Kippur, but on each of the fast days that occur during the course of the year, we read these words from the Torah. That is the assigned Torah portion for the fast day, as if the rabbis wanted to emphasize this is what God needs us to do. We are going to be concerned about how we act in the world. We're not always going to get it right, but remember that God is a forgiving God. And so by having tefillah, by having a prayer or the opportunity to worship in such a way where we are speaking to God and saying, God, you have guaranteed us this wonderful characteristic of yours, that you are willing to forgive. And so when we are fasting, it's typically because we're recalling a period where the Jewish people were punished. And so we do not want to be punished as our ancestors were. We're able to, as you said, take God's words. God has proclaimed God's self to be forgiving and patient and abounding in kindness and willing to forgive sin. And so we'll say this, and rather than a prayer through which we are saying to God, I'm sorry for what I have done. I will try to do better next time. That's part of teshuvah. That part we've already covered. We recognize we have to be able to acknowledge our misdeeds, apologize for them, and then commit to doing better. But here, the prayer isn't about saying, I'm sorry. It's about, God, we understand you to be of a certain nature, willing to understand that we are human. We're not perfect like you, or maybe even like the angels on high. We're human beings. You've given us the power to choose. And each and every day we're faced with all kinds of decisions. We're not always going to get it right. We're counting on you, God, to be forgiving. And that's the tefillah that we need to offer at this stage.
It's just something you mentioned about fast days as well, because it's not just fast days that we would also talk about this as also water. I think sometimes we forget here in Pennsylvania about the importance of water. But if we were in Israel or in other parts of our country, perhaps in the West Coast, you have a great appreciation for water, and droughts would be a big concern as well. And so that also is where in Jewish tradition, people would call out to God and pray towards God. So let's look at source number one, which is talking about a time of a drought. I know it's not Yom Kippur, but there's this other moment here of great anxiety, of unsure of when will the water return. Just as today we are, we've been feeling this uncertainty of how will we say Gemar Chatima Tova, that we should be inscribed in the book for good, that there's this moment of uncertainty, but we hope that we will be inscribed for good, just as I'm sure during a time of a drought that we're hoping that the rain will return. So here, Rabbi Walber, do you want to read for us the first text here from Ta'anit, from the section of the Talmud that talks about of these fasts?
Happy to. Another story is about prayer in the time of a drought. Rabbi Eliezer prayed before the ark and said 24 blessings, but was not answered. Rabbi Akiva prayed afterwards, saying, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, we have no sovereign but you. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, have mercy on us. And the rains fell. The rabbis murmured against him. This is very problematic, by the way. A heavenly voice called out saying, not because this Akiva is greater than Eliezer, rather because this Akiva has compassion on others when they do wrong, and Eliezer is not forgiving. So here we have a text which suggests that certain types of prayers are not going to be received, not because necessarily the worshiper has said the wrong words, but simply because of the nature of the worshiper. If the person himself is not a forgiving person, then, and as is the case with Eliezer, then there should be no expectation that God is going to accept those prayers wholeheartedly.
Well, part of this is what Stan brought up earlier, is the kavanah behind it, right? That we can just get up, we can open up our machzorim, and we can just start praying. And maybe is that all we should be doing today on Yom Kippur, is just opening the book, praying, or sitting on our couch and watching on TV this year services. But no, that's not the point here. Maybe that's what we're supposed to be doing here, is that we're supposed to be singing along. We're supposed to be saying Avinu Malkeinu. We can't just be flipping the pages, but there has to be something behind that. And what I think is interesting here is it's Akiva has compassion on others. But I love this thing of Avinu Malkeinu, right? That sounds so familiar today because we sing Avinu Malkeinu. It comes up in our prayers all the time. So it's interesting that on Yom Kippur, our services are much longer. Maybe it's to keep us occupied on this fast day. But there's something here that we add so much poetry, what we call piyutim, and we use different names for God that we would never use any other time, of Avinu Malkeinu. So why all this poetry and why all these names for God? I was thinking that this morning for myself, and it wasn't until when we started the Shachrit, the Shachrit Amidah. If you turn to page 252 in our Machzorim, or if you have any other machzor at home, it's just the beginning of any of the Amidah that we add in a special paragraph. And you know what? After working on the high holidays for the last several months, it finally hit me this morning of the importance of this one paragraph that we add in right after the Avot, of adding in about talking about our ancestors, our patriarchs and our matriarchs. There's this one paragraph here on page 252 is where I'm looking, where it says, Misor Chachamim, where it says, it's inspired by the insights of the sages and the teachings of those who have inquired wisdom. I open my lips in prayer and supplication to entreat the merciful sovereign who forgives and pardons sin. Well, the beautiful thing about our machzor here is that it adds some commentary. So I'm looking at the bottom right-hand corner of page 252. It says, inspired by the insight, Misor HaRachamim. It says, these lines serve to introduce piyutim, poetic additions to the Amidah that address the holy day's themes. The reference to sages and those who acquired wisdom is a relic of the area when adding adding these poems was a matter of controversy, which prompted this appeal to the authority of the sages who permitted them. This introduction proclaimed that the Amidas Piyutim are faithful to tradition and that they are saturated with biblical and midrashic quotations. Its words continue to have meaning as the leader's personal plea for inspiration to guide the congregation appropriately, a poignant reminder of the responsibility that the leader takes on in reciting or representing the congregation before God. Fascinating. We have this moment here where Piyutim, this poetry that we use, that we love, Avinu Malkeinu, well, it was controversial. Why do we need to use poems? What's the point of poems and these names for God? Why does this change everything? Why do we need these to have tefillah?
And this points to the importance of having a strong Jewish education and knowing some background. Here, we learned that Avinu Malkeinu were the words that Rabbi Akiva used, and his prayer was accepted, again, because he was a compassionate person, compassionate towards other people. Not that other people necessarily felt compassion towards him, because we saw in the text the rabbis murmured against him. I guess there was some jealousy that his offering of prayer was enough to get God to provide the people with rain when Eliezer, who was also a noted sage, offered 24 blessings and he was not answered. But once we understand that Avinu Malkeinu were the words offered by Rabbi Akiva, and it was because of his own compassion that his prayers were deemed acceptable and God was willing to fulfill his request, then whenever we recite Avinu Malkeinu, as we do throughout the High Holy Day period, we are supposed to remember that this is what it required of Akiva. And it's not just enough to offer prayers, to read what's in the Machzor or throughout the year of the Siddur and feel like that is going to have effect, but it is to remember that that has to be combined with the very kind of people that we want to be and strive to be, compassionate towards others, kind, forgiving. That's what God is looking for. It's what, as was suggested before, what exists behind the prayers that becomes all the more meaningful.
So I love that idea that what we're doing on Yom Kippur is maybe practice for the real world, right? That we are talking to God in our prayers, but really some of these things are for how are we supposed to interact with other people? How are we supposed to think about the world? But I want to go back to this idea about poetry and these names for God and maybe turn it over to you. If you feel comfortable to unmute yourself, if you have a thought or to just jump in, what are all these poems that we're using on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah? What are these poems or these names for God? How do they add to your tefillah that we don't have throughout the other times of the year when we do have tefillah? But what is the addition of these poems and these names for God that we use? How do they add to the experience for you? If you unmute yourself, love to hear.
Simply, I think it addresses the human emotion, distracting human emotion.
So there's something about poetry that we can feel different, that maybe there's some type of connection that we wouldn't feel any other way. Just this past Shabbat, we were reading Parshat Ha'azinu. It's interesting that it comes before Yom Kippur, at least it did this year. And that it itself is a poem. It's a poem by Moses, and maybe as you're mentioning, poetry can connect to us humans in a way that maybe just straight prayer might not in many ways. So today it's kind of maybe a helper for us to feel connected, to make that the human connection. I think what you're trying to say that we might not have experienced any other way.
That's right.
Any other thoughts about why this poetry that we include as tefillah on this day? Or perhaps is there a poem that we say that really speaks to you?
While people are thinking, I'll jump in. I think part of the power of the Avinu Malkeinu prayer is that we are so often talking about God in terms of being the sovereign on high, with the book of life in front of God and judging us during this period. And so we're thinking of God as almost unapproachable because God is sitting on high and and is the sovereign. But by referring to God also as Father, then we bring God close. And if we can picture God as being like a loving parent, then that gives us another approach to God. And perhaps we're able to speak these words with a different feeling behind them, because we feel like we're talking to somebody who is very both approachable and known to us, not so mysterious as the God who sits on high.
That comparison between both the parent and a king. I asked my nephew, my 4-year-old nephew, been singing Avinu Malkeinu because he heard Josh Roshowski during our family service singing it so much over Rosh Hashanah, so he loved it so much. Of course, we taught him what Avinu means. When we said Malkeinu, he goes, a king, and then he goes, I don't know any kings. He didn't know what that meant. Fascinating that we can relate to one metaphor, but not both. David Weiss, I see you have a hand raised.
I was just going to comment, going back to Rabbi Akiva. I was noting the fact that his prayer was a prayer for mercy, and the reason why it was accepted was because he was kind to others and reflected, kindness to others. And maybe it's a commentary on the fact that in trying to be more like God, the closer you are to try to achieve those attributes, and the way you describe to God, kindness, mercy to others, etc. When we pray and have these kind of these attributes to God, it's also something we try to aspire to, or should try to aspire to ourselves.
It's a beautiful comment. Love that. Thank you, David. Yes.
There's lots to think about it with prayers being aspirational, that we should be working towards them. And it's something, maybe this idea about a printed text, of having, that we live in a time where we do have a printed machzor, that we go back to these pages every year, and we try our best to live up to those from this year till next year. If we miss the mark, well, we'll read those texts again, and it will help us get closer to that ideal. I think that, David, you were talking about. I know it's not easy sometimes in prayer. Sometimes we feel it and sometimes we don't. Maybe it's actually more often we don't feel it. We don't feel that kavanah behind it. But I remember one time with Jules Gooden, who was the former director of USY. I remember at a USY convention at Hagesher, he had said, prayer, why do we do it? Because we do it, the 999 times, because it may just be that 1,000th time that we feel that connection. And I think that's maybe why tefillah is so much more difficult than tshuva and tzedakah, because maybe we understand there's this action that we're doing, and that we can feel the impact, or we can see the impact perhaps a little bit more immediate than maybe with tefillah. Because tefillah, I think it takes a little bit more out of ourselves than some of the other actions that are involved with this day. Tefillah, it's not just about reading the words on the page or listening to the words and saying amen. But we see here with Rabbi Akiva that we need to have a little bit of kavanah. We have to have more than just a little bit. We have to have kavanah behind those words.
We have time for the third text.
Yeah, and I think that actually brings up a great point of what are the words of tefillah that we're doing? And Rabbi Wahlberg and I, when we first looked at this text coming from Brachot, also from the Talmud, Rabbi Elazar, well, he seemed very, this whole section of the Talmud, he is calling out on a lot of different things. He actually says that the tefillah actually, he says is more important than, I'm trying to remember if it was tshuva or tzedakah. I think it was tzedakah that he actually says that tefillah is more important because it comes out of you. He actually says tzedakah is just giving of your money, of something material, but tefillah is giving of yourself. So what is he saying here? Rabbi Elazar had said, since the day of the temple was destroyed, the gates of prayer were locked, and the prayer is not accepted as it once was. As it is said in Lamentations from Eicha, what we read on Tisha B'Av, about the temple's destruction, it says, though I plead and call out, he shuts out my prayer. Yet despite the fact that the gates of prayer were locked with the destruction of the temple, the gates of tears, Dima, Share Dima, were not locked. And one who cries before God may rest assured that his prayer or her prayer will be answered. As it's stated, hear my prayer, Lord, and give ear to my pleading. Keep not silence at my ear. Here we have this idea that there's gates, right? Ne'ilah, this service that we add in that's right before Ma'ariv. We don't have Ne'ilah any other time of the year, but Ne'ilah was the time when it was the closing of the gates of the temple. And so we reenact that today. But we talk about the gates of prayer also closing. It's kind of strange because Rabbi Elazar says that the temple, since the temple was destroyed, the gates of prayer are already closed. We don't need Ne'ilah. The gates have been closed all this time. But there's something else here. What does he say that the gates that are open is the gates of tears? And maybe there's something about this that crying out. On Rosh Hashanah, we talk about Hannah. Hannah is crying out at Shiloh before the priest Eli, praying for a child. He thinks that she's drunk, but she's crying out to God. And maybe there's a little bit difference here. Thinking about the gates of prayer and the gates of crying out. Why have these two different gates?
So I think this points to the idea of kavanah, about the intention that you were just talking about, Rabbi Hollander, because at the outset, it seems very problematic that one of the great sages, Rabbi Elazar in this case, would suggest that with the destruction of the temple, God's not accepting prayers any longer. In fact, most of our tradition is built on the idea that because we can no longer offer sacrifices as a result of the temple's destruction, what do we have to replace it? Prayer. That's what God expects of us, to engage in prayer and worship. And here, for the sage to be suggesting that the gates are locked, God's not accepting prayers, is a difficulty, is a challenge to us. And then he adds what is really the crux of this, that God is willing to hear prayers accompanied by crying. And it's not to suggest that we have to be in a mournful, woeful state whenever we offer prayers, but it does suggest, as I think Rabbi Elazar would want us to understand, that you have to have the right intention behind the prayers. If you simply recite things from rote, if you're not thinking about what you're saying, but because they're in the prayer book, you're just reciting them, the proper prayers for the morning, for the afternoon, for the evening, right, on their scheduled times, the ones for Shabbat, the ones for particular holidays, just to recite the prayers isn't really meaningful, at least not as far as Rabbi Elazar was concerned. And I think most sages would say the same thing, that you have to be thinking about concentrating on what it is that you're saying, and the intent has to be behind these words, whatever it might be. Whether we are praising God, you have to do it with intention and believe that God is worthy of praise. If you are thanking God, again, it's with intention that God ought to be thanked, that we're not taking for granted so many of the blessings and experiences that we have in our lives. And when it comes to petition, when we're asking of things, that we truly believe that God is willing to hear those prayers and answer them. If we have a different idea about God, that maybe God exists, maybe God's listening, but perhaps not, or I am waiting for proof that God really exists before I think that any of this matters. So Rabbi Elazar would say, then that's not a prayer that God is willing to hear. The gates are closed to that. When you do it with intention, whether it's crying out or simply with an understanding that this is meaningful, that's where the tefillah, the gates are opened, so that God will accept those prayers.
We want to thank everyone for joining us as we've engaged in not just tefillah, but also tshuva and tzedakah over the high holiday services. And it's not over yet. And I think that's so important for all of us to think about. We're going to sign off in just a moment. Feel free to stay on here because at 11:30 is when we're going to start services up again. So feel free to either continue with your own Musaf silent Amidah if you'd like. You can follow along in your Machzorim. Or I would also invite you to maybe take this next 10 minutes to find a kavanah for yourself as we go into the Musaf service. It's a lot of repetition throughout the services. Maybe that means going outside, taking a walk for yourself, thinking about something, but not just going through the rote of turning the pages. But I hope that if you ever feel like the gates of prayer are closed, to remember that they're not, and that we can take care of ourselves. I hope that everyone has a meaningful day and can find that kavanah throughout the day as we engage in prayer. We look forward to seeing you throughout the day on services. Again, Musaf will be beginning at 11:30 with Hineni. And feel free to check the website for the rest of the schedule throughout the day. Kamar Chatima Tova.